US President Donald Trump says he's terminating trade talks with Canada over an ad featuring the words of former US President Ronald Reagan.
Canada, as we mentioned, reporting a trade surplus for September, the first one since January, and the start of the trade war with the U.S.
The U.S. trade representative is doubling down on threats to Canada, repeating comments today that the U.S. could withdraw from its trade deal with Canada and Mexico.
Tension began rising in Washington in a way that felt different from routine political noise. This was not the usual back and forth of policy debates or press statements. Something quieter, more deliberate, was taking shape beneath the surface of North American trade. Conversations behind closed doors started to reshape expectations. Signals coming from senior U.S. officials suggested that a major confrontation was forming, one that many believed would place Canada in a vulnerable position. The assumption was clear: increased pressure from Washington would force Ottawa to respond from a defensive stance. But as that pressure started pushing outward, the strategic landscape began shifting in ways few had anticipated. Each move triggered a reaction that complicated the original plan. Something had changed inside Washington's decision-making environment. The tone became sharper, the timing felt coordinated, and across policy circles, there was a growing sense that a calculated opening move had been placed on the geopolitical board, one aimed squarely at Canada. Three influential figures inside the U.S. policy system soon began operating with unusual alignment. Each of them directed attention toward Canada, and each signaled a willingness to challenge the foundations of North American trade. For a brief moment, it appeared the region was preparing for a seismic shift that could roll across borders without slowing down. The first signal came from U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. His warning carried more weight than a routine comment. He openly suggested that the United States could walk away from the USMCA in 2026. The statement was not framed as speculation.
And foremost, I want to make sure that our trading partners are following their current commitments. We have situations where Mexico is not following all of its commitments. We're working closely with them. They're being pragmatic. We've identified areas where we think Canada is falling down on their commitments. I don't have to talk about dairy too much in this group. Everyone knows.
It landed as a deliberate notice. Washington, he implied, was ready to reopen, replace, or even abandon the agreement that had become the backbone of continental trade.
It's truly for American workers and American businesses, and that's who it benefits. And that means a conversation about rules of origin. We did it for autos in the first Trump term. My sense is that on non-auto items, we also need to do this. We need to make sure that the terms of the agreement are benefiting American producers and workers. There are a variety of other things we can look at too, but that's one of the key things I'm looking at right now.
When Greer pointed to the approaching review and expiration timelines, it became clear that long-standing assumptions about stability between the United States, Canada, and Mexico could no longer be taken for granted.
In the first place, most Canadian goods come over duty-free because they comply with the rules of the USMCA, which the Senate passed in 2020. Second, and I'm happy to share some of this with you, but publicly, we know that there continue to be giant foreign-funded labs in Canada where they're producing fentanyl, and that is unacceptable. And I agree with you. We work well with the Canadians on border security and fentanyl issues, but they have giant.
Then the temperature rose further. President Donald Trump delivered his own message, one that carried the bluntness his critics and supporters have come to expect. He spoke openly about pushing back hard against Canada and went even further, suggesting that Ottawa should be treated like a 51st state.
Why don't you just join our country, you become the 51st state, and you get it for free?
The comment sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels. Investors who had long relied on predictable North American cooperation took notice. It was a signal that Washington intended to tighten its grip, expecting Canada to adjust its policies at a moment when tensions were already spreading across multiple industries. The third pressure point emerged when the U.S. ambassador raised concerns about Canada's political advertising rules. The suggestion was that these regulations could interfere with cross-border communication. Ottawa strongly disputed that claim. The disagreement stalled ongoing discussions and led Washington to consider a scenario few had expected: the idea of splitting the USMCA into two separate agreements, one with Mexico and one with Canada. The continent had not seen this level of uncertainty around its core economic framework in years. The possibility that the agreement could fracture entirely carried consequences far beyond a single dispute. Yet instead of weakening Canada, something unexpected began to happen. The pressure started bending back toward the United States. Canadian firms strengthened ties with Europe, India, and South America, rerouting exports through channels that bypassed U.S. transit systems. One of the clearest examples appeared in Newfoundland and Labrador. more than half of the region's oil production was redirected to Europe. Just a few years earlier, less than 10% flowed across the Atlantic. This shift reflected a broader transformation underway in Canada's export strategy. The deeper question became unavoidable. How does an attempt to pressure a trade partner turn into a catalyst for economic restructuring? As Canada diversified, the United States began feeling secondary effects. U.S. manufacturing output declined for 9 consecutive months, leading into November 2025. Investment analysts began classifying the United States as a higher policy risk environment. Reports showed capital flowing toward countries viewed as more predictable. Canada emerged as a key beneficiary. While the U.S. landscape appeared increasingly volatile, Canada positioned itself as a stable anchor for global business. The country held the second highest foreign direct investment to GDP ratio in the G20. Its network of more than 50 free trade agreements offered companies access to global markets without exposure to sudden policy swings. Firms from Japan, South Korea, and across Europe began establishing Canadian operations. This allowed them to remain close to North American consumers while shielding themselves from potential U.S. tariff shocks. Canada's infrastructure, workforce, and policy stability supported long-term planning. Even some American firms began treating Canada as a safer base while monitoring developments at home. At the same time, Ottawa pushed an internal restructuring of industrial capacity. The goal was clear: reduce dependence on U.S. components and strengthen domestic supply resilience. Surveys showed more than 70% of Canadian manufacturers supported government incentives for nearshoring and localization. Companies increased their reliance on domestic suppliers to avoid disruptions. Technology and advanced manufacturing exports began growing faster than traditional commodity shipments, signaling the rise of a new innovation-driven layer of the economy. As U.S. policy volatility increased, multinational firms increasingly viewed Canada as their primary anchor in the region. Strategic investments in technology, electric vehicles, and critical minerals began reshaping the balance of power. Observers warned the United States could face an unintended erosion of its leadership role. Political tensions added another layer. U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra addressed concerns about language in America's new national security strategy. Critics worried it could justify involvement in Canadian political debates. Hoekstra denied such intentions, referencing Ontario advertisements aired in the U.S. that quoted Ronald Reagan on tariffs. At the same time, he sought to ease fears that the U.S. planned to dissolve the USMCA outright. In an interview with the National Post, he emphasized that the upcoming review was built into the agreement from the start. Consultations were underway, and multiple paths remained possible. Momentum continued at the leadership level. Prime Minister Mark Carney met with President Trump and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum during a World Cup gathering in Washington. According to Carney's office, the leaders held a 45-minute discussion and agreed to keep working together. That raised the final question. As economic pressure and political strategy collide, is North America heading toward renewal or toward a fundamentally new trade order? To stay informed on every turn in this story, make sure to subscribe to Maple States. We'll continue breaking down what these shifts really mean for Canada, the United States, and the global economy. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next update.